Hello, I'm Amanda Walker and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing the United States right now. In today's episode, 4 years in, Ukraine remains locked in a grinding war of attrition with Russia. Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion enters its fifth year with multiple peace efforts started, but no clear end in sight. Donald Trump says the fighting must stop by June, having previously promised to end it straight away.
Let me just put it a nicer way. If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
The US has spent upwards of $175 billion helping Ukraine, but that funding has slowed. Coming up, we examine how long this can go on for.
I think Putin has a limited period of time in which he can continue this. It's hard to say exactly how long that is. But if you look at more soldiers being killed on the battlefield every month than they can replace them with, well, that's not a sustainable position.
And we speak to Ukrainians living in America as they grapple with the ongoing violence back home.
Every night there is an attack that is more dangerous, more deadly than the one before. And
do you worry then about your family and friends?
Yeah, all the time. I worry about my family, I worry about my colleagues in Ukraine, I worry about all the people in Ukraine. That's our organization, that's what we do. We try to support them in this war.
The number of Ukrainians living in the US has risen significantly since Russia's invasion, as many arrived here as refugees. They've been watching closely as the US responds to Russian attacks. While the official US position is, of course, in support of Ukraine, there have been moments where that position has felt vulnerable. So what are Ukrainians in the US thinking now? Faith and community. A critical source of hope for Ukrainians living in America. This weekly service at St. Andrew's Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral offers some comfort in the face of immense loss and suffering back home. The congregation includes refugees who fled the war, some from the actual front lines. Maxim Radyuk is in the US for physical rehabilitation. He says in April 2024, he was hit by a Russian drone. He suffered massive injuries and lost his sight. Sashko Vichruk is also in the US to try and heal. He fought for his country since before the full-scale invasion. He says one night at 11 p.m, his squad was attacked by 3 Russian drones. He waited all night in immense pain before medics could reach them. He is now trying to mend his body and rebuild his life in America. But things will never be the same for him and his wife. Olha says people need to understand that Russia is a terrorist country trying to destroy Ukraine's people, its children, and its civilization. She pleads with America to help. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the US mobilized with gusto, expressing both outrage and huge humanitarian support. 4 years in, the support is still there, but it has waned. It's Marina Baidyuk's mission to keep Ukraine's plight front and center. She's the president of United Help Ukraine. For years, she's been organizing rallies at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., raising millions of dollars along the way. Her father and sister are still in Kyiv.
And since then, it's been really challenging 4 years now. And my family is feeling the same cold, no power, no electricity, no heat for days. It's been brutal winter in Ukraine, sub-zero temperatures. And I would say they're still lucky. My family, my sister has a power station, my father has a power station. That means they can plug it in when there is electricity, which is just imagine just a few hours a day you have electricity. Every night there is an attack that is more dangerous, more deadly than the one before.
Marina's work was rewarded with top honours from Ukraine's leader. She says it was one of the best moments of her life. She has faith that President Zelensky can get Ukraine through this dark chapter.
He's been the right leader from the beginning, especially from the beginning of the full-scale invasion when he was offered to escape. I don't need a ride, I need ammunition.
Like most Ukrainians, she watched this highly fractious Oval Office moment between President Zelensky and Trump with a heavy heart.
From the very beginning of the war,
You're not in a good position.
I
You don't
was
have the cards right now. With us, you start having
not playing cards.
Right now, you don't.
I'm very
You're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're gambling
I'm
with the lives of
war.
millions of people.
What was going through your head?
That was a very tough moment for all of us, especially Ukrainians, but not just Ukrainians. Americans were shocked. The world was shocked that in the Oval Office, the president of a free country can be treated that way. I remember that day we received thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of messages from American people saying, we stand with President Zelensky, we stand with you. People started sending us messages, emails, but also started sending us money. They said, we're standing with you, we're standing with Ukraine. And I remember when I was watching, of course, I was in shock and disbelief that that's happening, but we had a meeting with President Zelensky right after. And I was surprised to see him still coming to see Ukrainian diaspora leaders being positive.
Really, after that moment?
After that moment.
Do you think he just compartmentalized and put it to one side? And
I think he was just from the beginning, he said this was a working moment. We understand there are differences in approaches. We understand that the peace talks are starting, and we hope that we're going to progress at the good speed and continue to do so. It's been a progress since then. And I just remember that feeling that we were all in disbelief and despair, but when he walked into that room with just a few dozens of us in that room, his energy was palpable, that he was determined that everything's going to be okay. The resilience continued.
with moments like what happened in the Oval Office, do you worry that Ukraine does not have America's full support? And can Ukraine get through this without that?
Of course, the United States has delivered unprecedented amount of support to Ukraine. Putin says, in most cases, is a lie.
Donald Trump's actions have at times led Ukrainians to doubt the crucial US support that they know they cannot win the war without. That war has come to define their country.
5, 6, 7, 8.
Choreographer Olga Aru owns a dance company. They're rehearsing a Ukrainian dance for Washington's upcoming Cherry Blossom Festival.
Ukrainian dances are very fast for the most part, very upbeat, very lively, very happy, and I think that's what makes our people stronger.
Olga wants the world to know there's more to her home country than anguish and suffering.
It is very important to remind the world that Ukrainian is so much more than the war. It's beautiful art, music, dance, history, culture, and I think one of the very significant examples of the human resilience right now during this like power outages and horrific war and shelling is that people still live in their lives in Ukraine. You could see young guys playing soccer wearing the flashlights on their heads. You could see people doing like a random pop-up concerts on the little plazas, little squares at night, bringing their portable speakers and playing guitar. And I think just watching that, watching their strength, makes us stronger here and makes me want to create more art and share it with the world.
Now, few people believed the war would last this long, even those with an inside track. Kurt Volker is a former US ambassador to NATO, and he was the US Special Representative for Ukraine under the first Trump administration. I wanted to get his take on why this situation has gone on for so long. So was Biden too slow on that?
Oh, far too slow and far too grudging. And even 3 years in, at the end of the Biden administration, we were still telling the Ukrainians, don't fire anything inside of Russia. Can you imagine that you're being attacked in your country from the other side of the border and you're not allowed to hit back? That is insane. And that was US policy under the Biden administration. Then I thought that President Trump, with his focus on ending the war, would have put pressure on Putin more swiftly. Additional sanctions, oil and gas pressure, in particular the markets where the money comes from, and lifting the restrictions on weapons for Ukraine. Paid for, of course. Europeans are buying them now. It's not American taxpayers. But there's no reason to have these restrictions on the type of weapons, the range of weapons, the use of weapons. Ukraine is defending itself, and yet we've left those in place. So it's surprising to me that we have let it go this long.
You alluded to it there, Donald Trump saying that he would end this war on day one. Obviously, that hasn't happened. Yeah. But just talk us through what he has done. I'm thinking of Europe specifically because, Europe has stepped up. And that needed to happen, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you framed the question that way because most people don't acknowledge that Trump has actually done a lot. The most important thing is that he has everybody talking about ending the war. If you remember back to the Biden administration, we were talking about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. And no one could tell you what it is. And there was no end to taxpayer support for Ukraine. It was just going to be an endless war. So President Trump has flipped that, and now everyone is focused on ending the war. Second, he has gotten Ukraine to agree publicly that they would accept a ceasefire in place and accept that Russia will occupy parts of Ukraine for a long time. Not recognized as Russian territory, which it should never be, but at least understood that it's going to be occupied for a long time, but we can have a ceasefire and move from there. That's a big step for Ukraine, a very big step. He's also gotten this U.S.-Ukraine Recovery Investment Fund in place, so-called minerals deal. This creates a shared economic interest in Ukraine's economic development, which is good. He has gotten European countries to agree to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP, which is very good for European security overall, but also good for Ukraine. He has gotten European countries to agree to deploy a force to Ukraine after a ceasefire, a so-called coalition of the willing would deploy to Ukraine to deter future Russian attacks. He has gotten lots of countries, together with Ukraine, to agree to security guarantees for Ukraine, again, to deter future Russian attacks after there's a ceasefire. So he has moved the needle on all of these things, except Putin's desire to wage this war.
So with that in mind, if you break this down to two characters, Trump and Putin, if you need more pressure on Putin, the nature of their relationship has been the subject of fascination. Donald Trump seems to express this admiration for Putin. So with that in mind, is he capable of applying that pressure, of being as tough as you're saying he needs to be on Putin?
I think he's capable, I do. And I don't think he's beholden to Putin. Which many people allege, but I don't think that's right either. I think Trump is motivated by the deal. I think he wants to actually get an agreement with Putin because then it'll last, then you'll have sanctions, then you can go back into business and making money. And so this is where Trump really wants this to go. He's very reluctant to give up on that idea. And of course, Putin knows that. And so Putin exploits that desire on Trump to dangle deals, to say, oh, there'll be billions, there'll be trillions of dollars that we can make together once this war is over. But in order to get there, you have to pressure the Ukrainians to give us the territory. You have to get them to surrender. You have to make sure there's no security guarantees for Ukraine, and on and on and on. So Putin is using Trump's desire for a deal against him in order to create conditions that are better for Russia in waging the war.
But as you said earlier, if Russia is struggling right now in lots of different ways, and the economy is obviously crucial, Putin is still not showing any signs of stopping here. How long can he go on for? What can stop him at this point?
Yeah, I think Putin has a limited period of time in which he can continue this. It's hard to say exactly how long that is. But if you look at more soldiers being killed on the battlefield every month than they can replace them with, well, that's not a sustainable position. If you look at the economy, where they are facing high inflation and high interest rates now for a couple of years, that erodes people's purchasing power, their ability to buy houses, their confidence in the economy. That can't go on forever. And in fact, inflation is escalatory in that scenario. Oil and gas markets are moving away from Russian oil and gas. So I think that if we just have things the way they are, no additional pressure on Russia than is already there, he can probably do this for another year or two before he runs out of money and runs out of soldiers. But if we act decisively, as we have not done, but if we act decisively with secondary sanctions targeting the Kremlin's finances and making sure that Ukraine has what it needs to blunt Russia's attacks even better, I think that timeline can be shortened, maybe even shortened to as much as this year. And to be clear, I don't believe there will ever be a peace deal. Putin will never accept a sovereign and independent Ukraine. But I think we can get a ceasefire. And if we do, then people stop dying, and we can then put in place mechanisms to deter new attacks.
And Russian spending, what about US spending? I think five major bills over the past 4 years, $175 billion. It's a big burden on taxpayers, more on Europe now. But how much of a hard sell is this going to be? Because this keeps going. Essentially, you're committed to an open-ended war at the moment. That's a tough sell for the American taxpayer.
You're right about that. An open-ended war is something no one is interested in. Nobody would support that. So we have to actually favor an end of the war and say, this is what we're going to do.
Is that why the June deadline is coming in? Is that as much for voters as it is for Ukraine and Russia?
You know, President Trump had a 1-day deadline, a 100-day deadline, a 6-month deadline, 2-week deadline, 2-week deadline.
Loves a
deadline. This is another deadline. So I think this is just to try to create pressure. But until you're actually willing to apply pressure, it's not going to end the war. This is one thing where I disagree with President Trump. He believes that the key to ending the war is Ukraine conceding territory. That's not true. Putin will continue the war even after that. The key to ending the war is changing the incentives for Putin. He needs to see that it is too costly for him in terms of lives and money and sustainability of the Russian state to continue the war. And that he doesn't see right now. There is a huge platform of support for more pressure on Putin if Trump chooses to go that way.
Former NATO ambassador Kurt Volker there. So for 4 years, the world has witnessed intense fighting, destruction of infrastructure, a profound humanitarian crisis, and mass displacement of Ukrainians. And it's not letting up. The Trump administration is coming under increasing pressure to end it. There are plenty of ideas about what a ceasefire might look like, but are they realistic? Joining us to discuss are our panelists, Donald Jensen, a former US diplomat in Moscow and Russian foreign policy expert, and Fred Fleitz, former US official at the National Security Council and US national security expert. Fred, let me start with you. The broad view is that Putin is playing for time. That's something that Donald Trump has even admitted. How can you have meaningful peace negotiations with that in mind?
Well, it's great to be here. First of all, there were no peace negotiations before Trump was elected. And I think he's finding that peacemaking is very difficult and it's time consuming. And there's no question that Putin does not want peace right now. But this process, I think, is making slow progress. There's been 2 trilateral meetings recently. There is a framework agreement for a security assurance package between the US and Ukraine, but we're not going to get there without substantially more pressure on Russia. There has to be substantial economic pressure, energy pressure, and we need the help of Europe. Europe has to stop buying Russian energy. Europe has to pressure India and China to stop buying energy from Russia.
Yeah, pressure on Putin is something that Kurt Volker also said needs to happen. Is Donald Trump going to do that, do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with Fred that the Trump administration deserves a great deal of pressure, a great deal of praise, not the pressure, the praise, for getting the process on a peace track. The problem is we're bogged down. I'm not at all hopeful that we'll come to some kind of understanding on this incredibly complicated process anytime soon. And I do think Putin and the Kremlin are dragging it out, hoping that the West will crack, or that the Ukrainian society will crack, or the Ukrainian military will crack. I do not think that's likely.
And President Trump, we know, deal maker in chief, wants a deal, is convinced that Putin will go for a deal. What should that deal look like?
Well, I think there's going to have to be an agreement where we get an immediate ceasefire. I don't think the territorial issues will be resolved easily. My colleague, General Keith Kellogg, the former Ukraine Special Envoy, we wanted to freeze the conflict in place and start long-term negotiations in a situation that would be similar to the Korean armistice. I think that's probably the best that we can get. There will be a lot of issues that have to be resolved later. I hope that's what they're focusing on.
And 4 years into this, what is the single biggest assumption, do you think, that Washington got wrong about this whole situation from the start?
Well, I think one of the fundamental problems, which is rarely talked about, is that we are mirror imaging our own view of what a deal would be, what negotiations would be. And the Russians see negotiations as a way to advance their interests, and they talk when they feel it helps them, and they don't talk when they don't want to, they feel another strategy would be more useful. For Moscow, negotiations, unless they're pressed, and I agree with Fred on that, are another form of warfare. It's just non-kinetic. And that's what we're seeing now, where we have this circularity about ceasefire, as Fred said, ceasefire, the land issue, Moscow's completely separate demands. They're all interlocked, and you cannot solve one part of it without solving the whole thing.
And Fred, let's talk a bit about US support over the time since the full-scale invasion. How would you describe the general arc of that support?
We would not be here if it wasn't for Joe Biden. By demonizing Putin, by isolating Putin, we're driving him into the arms of China, and I think that Trump underestimated how bad U.S.-Russia relations were when he became president. That Putin was Biden once compared Putin to Hamas. And I think that made this a much bigger lift than it would have been. I think if the U.S. understood Putin's paranoia about Ukraine moving closer to the West, his paranoia about NATO membership, this could have been avoided. But Biden didn't do that. European leaders didn't do that. So Trump has to counter that also. European leaders aren't helping. They should be helping us by trying to engage with Putin, to try to get Putin to negotiate. But I think demonizing Putin, pushing him into the arms of China, is very, very dangerous for global security.
Does engaging Putin, though, give him more of an opportunity to play the US?
Well, I mean, what other choice do we have? We're either going to go to war with Putin or we're going to deal with him diplomatically. We're not going to go to war with Russia. We have to find a way to negotiate with him. And we know the solution to end this war will be far less than perfect. I mean, in a perfect world, Putin would be put on trial for war crimes. Every inch of Ukraine would be given back. We know that's not going to happen. We have to get the best solution possible to stop the killing. Stopping the killing has always been Trump's priority.
Donald, did Biden mess this up?
My problem with Biden is the drip, drip, drip of weapons sales by system, by domestic pressure in Washington. I think that was very counterproductive. There were several times in the past 4 years where Russia could have been broken, not only that so-called offensive a few years ago, but in other ways as well. My problem with the Trump approach is we're going drip, drip, drip on the diplomatic front. It's sort of the if you forgive a technical word, the non-kinetic version of that. And I don't think, it's like boiling a frog. You can turn it up a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, and that may in the end get the U.S. a sovereign, independent Ukraine and so forth, as we all want, but it's going to be much more difficult than we push Putin harder, I think. And to that extent, I would agree with Fred.
And this idea of a war of attrition, I mean, could this ultimately be the thing that ends this war? You talked about it, Donald, a huge loss of life of Russian soldiers. I mean, how long can that sustain itself? Is,
Well,
is that going to be ultimately what stops it?
My personal view, talking to a lot of people who follow this closely, is that they can last a long time. The problem is continuing to procure bodies. And now, according to President Zelensky, and I believe him, the replacement ability is less and less and less. So the Russians do not have the manpower to expand the war on another front. The Russians are struggling to do that, and they're struggling economically to support that, because with a 30% or so of the national budget devoted to war and arms procurement and all those other things, Putin is really locked into a position where if he backs off, he's got incredible economic disruption at home.
Fred, what would running out of military steam look like?
Well, I agree with that, but I think Ukraine has a bigger manpower problem. They will run out of troops first. We're not near that point right now. I think right now we're looking at a war of attrition between both sides with enormous losses, very high losses on the Russian side. I think the Russians can pull troops from remote areas of Russia, so the people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they're not aware of the toll that the war is taking on their people. But I am concerned Ukraine is eventually going to run out of troops. So the time is running down. That's why I'm hoping that we can put this economic pressure on Russia right now.
And final one-word answer, if you don't mind, from both of you. June deadline, yes or no?
I don't think the deadline will stick.
No.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Maybe not, no.
Okay, all right, got it. Thank you both so much for your time. Really interesting conversation. So, the war continues and negotiations continue. We're certainly going to be watching this story in the weeks, months, hopefully not years to come. That's it for this week's show. Thank you for watching. Do join us next time on Inside America.